Troglodyte warning. The question on everyone's lips, and probably will be for the next 5 years, is could Nigel Farage become the next Prime Minister? Well, let's get into a discussion with Rachel Johnson that poses this question.
So in a previous life, Rachel, I spent during the general election campaign, I went kind of underneath the bonnet of Reform and spent lots of time kind of going inside, working out their structures, working out their party structures and working out how it all really worked. And I have to say, it was fascinating because basically there weren't really any party structures. It was a proper shoestring. And they didn't do any vetting, as we know, because there was scandal after scandal during that general election campaign of all these people that they...
I thought Farage had a company who kind of vetted them all and they did a number on him and he was going to sue them. Oh, okay. It's a lie. Oh, okay.
Had chosen to be candidates. And it was really different from the way the Brexit Party and indeed UKIP had been set up, where there were proper party structures. And they said that just hadn't really worked for them. So they basically had set it up in this really shoestring.
They're so bad. The candidates are going to be so bad and so racist and so just thugs that we thought, save a bit of money by not vetting.
Way. But what was interesting was they managed to make huge impact. And I went to the event that Nigel Farage announced. So 24 hours after he announced he was going to stand as a candidate in Clacton, he was taking over the leadership of the party again. And he announced it with 24 hours notice in Clacton. I was there. And honestly, people absolutely desperate to sort of touch Nigel, desperate to be near him. Hundreds and hundreds of people, if not thousands, I was told it was thousands, I'm going to say hundreds and hundreds of people turned up to see him. And there was real momentum behind him. And as I say, no structure then, but they got 14.3% of the vote. They got 5 MPs, and Nigel Farage is the person I can confirm. It's not just the Sloney Pubs. It's not just the Spectator Party. He is the person everybody seems to be talking about. Everybody seems to be asking that question. Could he really do it? And especially when you've got Donald Trump as the incoming president and you've got his best mate, Uncle Musk, Elon, exactly, there as well, who we know at the very least they are in talks. We know Nigel Farage is having conversations with Elon Musk. We know that his new treasurer, Nick Candy, is having these conversations too. Whether or not he gives $100 million, which I think would change the game, they are having these conversations and then they are really alive to it. So there is something very interesting going on.
I think that 100 million obviously would change the game. Farage is very good at outreach. He did well with younger people in the 20s, and TikTok podcast was a game changer for Donald Trump. Great way to get to young people. But I think the problem with Farage, he's more divisive than Trump is in America. A YouGov poll puts his popularity at 38%, but the dislike level is 49%. So you have got a good proportion of the country that completely hate Farage, and I think he is more divisive. And obviously our first past the post system means that maybe in the elections in Wales and Scotland next year, maybe they get 80 or 90 new seats. Potentially, I think they will do well next year, but it means how can they do in the election? Because they will have to make some potential pact with the Tory party if they wanted to win. I don't think that's going to happen if Kemi Badenoch is the leader. Will she be the leader in a year? At this rate, maybe not. Or maybe they feel like they have to keep her. If she continues just not being a serious politician, she seems quite thin-skinned. She needs to kind of up her game and kind of focus on attacking Keir Starmer. She's not very good at it. There is a lot of questions. And that's the thing. A lot has happened already this year. And Farage could do a lot. I think that the potential is there as time goes on.
Aggie, well, as you say, the path to power could run through Clacton. But Reform is on 25 now. When you were doing that inside job on Reform, they were on 14, I think you said. Now they're 10 points ahead of that. Labour's only, this is within the margin of error, of course. Labour is on 26, the Conservatives are on 23. And of course, he already changed the weather back earlier this year when Rishi actually called the election, because I think you were saying this at another point, because he thought if we called the election now, it would spike Reform's guns because Farage would be off in America sucking up to Donald Trump. But of course, and he wouldn't come back and lead Reform. But that didn't work out for Rishi, did it?
No, indeed. And I think that was part of the reason that he called the election when he did, as we talked about before. But you know what's so interesting about, I mean, how much changes in just 5 months. The night before I published that podcast, I'd sort of finished it, wrapped it in a bow, and a poll came out saying that for the first time, Reform had overtaken the Conservatives in one poll overnight. And I had to cycle back to the studio and re-record because this was such a moment. And now that, I mean, you wouldn't even blink at that. And now we are having conversations about Reform overtaking Labour. And that's just with 5 months difference. So you can kind of understand why those conversations are happening. And I think people I'm speaking to are pretty sceptical at the moment that actually he could do it in 2029. What they are not sceptical about is the fact that they really could overtake the Conservatives in terms of seats for the next election, which is really, really stark. And I think part of that is because people aren't hugely, I don't know whether you're hearing differently, people I'm speaking to aren't hugely impressed at the moment with Kemi Badenoch. I think, to be fair to her, it is more difficult coming in when you're not kind of announcing lots of policy. And she made these slightly odd remarks this week about saying lunch was for wimps, and she wasn't a lunch
Only
person.
steak for her.
And she wouldn't touch bread if it was moist.
I know.
And that sort of seems
Imagine
to be
daring to use the word moist. I mean, you know, you've got to hand it to her. I've got lots of questions. Do you see any sort of pact being, you know, of course there was a pact between the Brexit Party and the Tories à l'époque. Do you see the Tories having to ask Nigel Farage for some sort of pact in order to have any chance at all in unseating Labour in 2029?
So I think I would be very surprised if there was an official pact, but it was really interesting. There was a story this week about the idea that locally, unofficially, Conservatives were starting to have talks with Reform about standing aside at the next local elections. I phoned a few people and everyone said, Aggie, this is absolutely categorically not true. However, they did say, oh, but I know this Conservative in my local patch who has said to the Reform guys, where are you going to stand? And I had a couple of conversations like that. So I think it is perfectly plausible. And as you said, Rachel, it was both from that direction. It was both Conservatives saying to Reform, oh, hang on, maybe you could stand aside, rather than Reform saying to the Conservatives, as it's been in the past. So I think that is perfectly plausible. Even as soon as next year at the locals, I think it is unlikely that there'll be a kind of an official pact.
People are also saying that Nigel's very charismatic, he's a brilliant communicator, but he's not a prime minister in waiting, and indeed he may not even want to be prime minister. Could there be a scenario in which Reform takes a lot of seats off Labour because they're second in 89 seats out of 98 held by Labour or something like that? They come second rather than third or fourth. And they could get another big beast to come in and actually do the top job. Do you see that as a likely outcome?
Possibly, but I've always got the sense that Nigel Farage would rather love to be Prime Minister. I mean, I think it's a different question whether he would be good at it. I'm not sure he's kind of had that kind of role before. But I don't know. He was so desperate to be a Member of Parliament. As you say, he tried 5 times. And I think he sort of hearing him talk at Spectator, that clip you just played, he sort of loves being in the centre of it. I could completely believe that he would love to be Prime Minister. So I'm not necessarily sure that he would like to... Go on.
Just that feeling I get. I mean, I've known Nigel for a long time. I mean, I sort of feel that his aim is to be the centre of attention. So at the moment, things are perfect for him because the 2 main parties are rattled. He's delivering on his promises and his threats when it comes to reform. And he's in the ascendant. And this is just where he wants to be. Does he really want the hard yards of deciding what happens, whether he puts boots on the ground to defend Western Europe? I mean, is that really Nigel Farage?
I think I agree. I think Farage really thrives on the outskirts of politics, and under scrutiny, he kind of does break quite quickly. He kind of doesn't like questioning. He can't take the hard questions. I mean, Trump can just kind of just flick him off. Like any hard question, he kind of just will just lie, or kind of very good at just dismissing tough ball questions. Farage isn't. Farage tries to answer them in a way where he's trying to give a perception of truth, but he gets rattled very easily. And the reality of being prime minister, I just don't think you could hack it, because you've got to make real decisions. You're not just on the side. You've got to appease your base, which again, he won't be able to do mass deportations. If he does a budget like Liz Truss, that's going to crash the economy. His popularity is just going to go. The reality of him being prime minister, I don't think he could hack. I don't think he would sit well in that position.
I don't know. I mean, I had a really revealing conversation with him during that podcast where he basically talked about, it was just after someone had thrown a milkshake at him in Clacton. And he said, you know, it's really, really difficult. It's really difficult being a politician. And I find it really hard. My family finds it really hard when I get this abuse, when stuff like this happens to me. And it's this sort of human moment. I thought, why are you doing this?
He's actually got a very thin skin. And
Yeah.
so did Rishi Sunak, I'm afraid. I don't know whether Keir Starmer has got such a thin skin, and that may stand him in good stead.
Yes.
He's not, he's just more hardened, battle hardened, and he seems to be able to take the blows.
Yes, although he did seem to get pretty wound up by Freebigate, the kind of days after days. You kind of can see him getting a bit wound up in the chamber, but I think probably everyone gets cross in that environment, don't they, in the House of Commons?
Lastly, Aggie, is Nigel, are we seeing peak Nigel Farage, or do you see him managing to keep riding this wave so it builds and builds and builds and builds and then crests at just the right time?
I think it is going to be really, really difficult for him to do that. I think in a way that you just described, we're seeing peak Nigel Farage right now, but in the way that he is very much enjoying himself. He's sort of able to deliver on his promises. There may well be a ceiling, but I do think the fact, I come back to the point I made at the beginning, that 14.3% of the vote that they got in 2024, and they came second in oh so many seats, when they just didn't have a functioning structure or a functioning party at all. And, you know, they are drawing more and more people in. They've just breached 100,000 members. And I just think, I do wonder whether, you know, the wave is going to keep rising a little longer, and it may crash well before the general election. But we've got the locals next year. We've got Wales and Scottish elections the year after that, and they are feeling pretty optimistic about those. And it may land him in good stead for 2029. It may have crashed well before then.
So I think I kind of agree with that. I don't think we've hit peak Farage yet. I would like to think we have, but I think next year, potentially, if he does well in the local elections, he gets a good number of seats, that will really be good for him, his momentum. People will start to worry. Labour, hopefully, will start. I think they are aware of Farage and how they need to kind of keep an eye on him. But I think inherent to kind of far right politics is that kind of self-destruction. Ben Habib has left under scrutiny. I think there's a good chance that Farage is going to upset his base. Once he has to come out with the policies and has to kind of give concrete objectives, what he can, what he can't do, I think people will start to get upset with him, with the mass deportations. Like, what's the reality of what Farage can actually do? Once that's laid out, again, I think we'll see that a little bit with Trump. He's already said that he's going to be very hard to lower grocery prices. Tariffs are going to hurt people. They will. Tariffs will hurt consumers. People will see the reality of the Trump presidency. And then will they see maybe who Farage is? Will people realize? Because there are a certain amount of people who are kind of distancing themselves from Farage, his fans. He has lost a bit of support. And often, like the left usually do, they fracture. I think the right will fracture in the next few years. You've got Kemi Badenoch. You've got the more radical flank of Tommy Robinson's support, UKIP, who want Farage to be more radical. He knows he can't be. And a lot's going to happen. It's going to be, I think it's going to get pretty wild. So comment below, what chance at the moment is there for Farage to be the next Prime Minister? And will it all crash and burn? I think it will. I think it's inevitable. But I think it's a question of when, because we haven't hit peak Farage yet, but we will at some point. And, what happens then? Who replaces Farage? So comment below, and I'll see you in the next video.